I want to start with the situation here in Canada this past week, obviously. What, if anything, Mr. Fadden, does the tragedy in Saint-Foy say about our security?
Well, I would say initially that we are subjected to the same sorts of threats as just about every other country in Canada are subjected to, in the world are subjected to. And I guess the thing that struck me more than anything is the difficulty of dealing with lone wolves. And I think that's what Mr. Bissonnette was. It's very hard to criticize the police or the security agencies when somebody just decides to go out and to do something appalling like he's done. I think the key, though, is this is not the end of the world, as appalling as it is. We need to carry on, and I guess we need to make sure that our Muslim co-citizens feel welcome. But the worry, I think, not just here, but in the States and elsewhere, is this lone wolf factor, which we have not come to grips with.
You've been talking here in Canada about cybersecurity. Does the internet in some ways help deal? Is it a useful tool in dealing with a lone wolf?
Actually, it may, on balance, make it more difficult. Look, all societies have isolated people who are looking for something greater than self. And so they reach out to become part of something. They can become part of the boys club. They could join the army. In my country, they can join the Crips or the Bloods, less desirable outcome. In today's world, they can attach themselves to particularly violent global jihadist movements, even if they're not related, associated with that in their immediate vicinity. Now, this appears to have been the other side of that kind of thing. But when you look at what the internet is able to do in terms of motivating people with whom you don't have physical contact, I don't know the details of this particular case, but certainly in the American case, when we find someone who's gone to a violent act, jihadist or non-jihadist, you do find a web history where that individual seems to have collapsed the broader parts of their personality into that very, very narrow funnel of communication with the web and becomes an almost unmediated individual without external influences other than that very narrow focus. And very unfortunately, the web has made that more possible.
Is there anything that security forces, police can use to counteract that? I mean, it's out there. The web is there because we want freedom of information in some fashion. What do you think, Mr. Fadden?
Well, I think the issue is really what do we monitor and what do we not monitor? And I mean, this is a constitutional democracy based on the rule of law, and we don't want a 1984. So somewhere there's a limit. I'm not sure there's a lot that we can do. I mean, both Canada and the United States and other countries monitor the worst of the jihadist sites.
Or the extreme
Absolutely, right wing. But, we have the authority under Canadian law to close them down if there's any in Canada, but you close one down and two more pop up. I think in practical terms, in cases like Bissonnette and others, if the family or if friends or the community don't see something happening and see something happen and don't do something about it, it's very hard to catch them. And even there, you don't want to turn this country into a Stasi-like environment where everybody snitches on everybody. But if the community can find a way to sort of keep an eye out and to try and discourage people, I think that's the first line of defense.
Mm-hmm. You've also said publicly that you think President Trump's ban on immigration and, basically been described as a ban on Muslim immigration is going to make the United States less safe. Yeah. In that context, tell me why.
Yeah. And it plays very much into the overall picture that we're painting here. So the ban, in terms of having any legitimacy, had to be based upon an imminent apocalyptic description of danger, which I don't think is true, from refugees and green card holders and visa holders, and an almost dystopian system for filtering these people out so we don't let them into the United States, which I know not to be true. And yet we went ahead and took this step to solve a problem that probably didn't exist. But the second and third order effects of that step are what make us less safe. Look, there is a civil war going on within Islam. Now, there's some in my country who want to describe this as a war between us and Islam, and there's certainly elements that would suggest that, but in my heart, I believe fundamentally the center of gravity of this fight is a civil war within Islam, frankly, not too much unlike the one within Christendom in the 17th century. Faith, reason, role of the state, all those kinds of things. And ours was really bloody too, all right? So it's playing out in this other great monotheism. Well, we have an interest in it. We certainly believe what a positive outcome would look like. When we do what it is we did, my country does what it was we did this past weekend, we reinforce the narrative of the group within Islam we do not want to win. That group that has the narrative that this is indeed a clash between civilizations, that there is undying antipathy between Islam and what you and I call the West and the modern world. And then within that civil war within Islam, and you've got this group that hates us, the others that are neutral or are trying to help us suddenly look at what it is we've just done and said, maybe those guys have a point. There's nothing else that explains it. And so that's why people of my background really think this was harmful to America. No, not just bad on a humanitarian level, which it was. Not that it just didn't do any good, which I don't think it did. It actually makes it worse. It makes the world more dangerous.
Can I add a thought?
Yes, of course.
I agree with what Mike is saying about the internecine nature of this, but I had some research done once about what was the last time a Western country invaded a non-Muslim country. And you know what it is? What it was? Is Grenada. So while I agree with Mike, you can understand why they all think we're at war with them. Every country, and I don't mean just the United States here, I mean the alliance, every time we've invaded or we've dealt harshly with a country since Grenada, it's been with respect to a Muslim country. So we have some distance to go to convince them that we're not their enemy. So I think if you add that to what Mike says, we have some distance to go.
So you've got this group who takes that narrative and says, there you go, what further need we of proof? This is done. They attach it to a particularly old and violent strain of Islam in the past, and then go to holy books to try to proclaim their legitimacy. There's a whole bunch of people within Islam who thinks about them the way you and I do. They're just wrong. But again, when we live their story, or when we seem to live their story, we strengthen them.
Yeah.
Assess the risk for me between the fear that President Trump is playing into here, that somehow there's an Islamist threat, and the actual threat from within, because certainly in this country, the terrorist acts that we've seen have come from within. The perpetrators have been of us, in that sense.
That's interesting. I would argue that since 9/11, we've fought two wars against terrorism. The physical war, we've in fact won. There has not been a directed attack against North America since 9/11. They've all originated in some shape, form, or other from the inside, or they've been inspired but not directed. But the war that I think we've lost is what I call the propaganda war. And it's the war that inspires people along the lines that Mike has said. We have spent in the West trillions of dollars. We have established, in some cases, draconian rules and laws, and we've really ratcheted up fear. So I mention this as a prelude to answering your question, which I think is, if you look at the causes of death in North America, if I recall correctly, there are more bicycle-related deaths in both our countries than there are from terrorism, except for 9/11, which was a particularly bad year. So I think part of our problem is, yes, there's a threat, yes, there's a problem internally, and it comes from the right as well as the left, but in truth, it's not as significant as any number of other causes of death and destruction in North America. But I do think in North America, unlike Europe, where the circumstances are different, the greater risk is from inside.
You agree?
Oh, I do. And I go back to why this was such a bad weekend.
Yeah.
All right. The people then who are convinced they do hate us, they all hate us. I'll never be an American. I was wrong. I will never become part of this society. We now make it more likely that some young, usually a man, usually second generation, inside the United States or even in Canada, will now say, I got it, these people are my enemy, and they will then go and act out. That's why people like me think this was so dangerous.
So you, in your previous jobs, have had to assess risk. From your vantage point now, then, what do you worry about?
The insider threat, certainly. And then maybe the low to mid-range, externally orchestrated attack. I do think, because of the things our countries have done in concert with our allies since 9/11, the 9/11 attack, complex, slow-moving, multi-actor, mass casualty, iconic target, nah, we're good enough at this. We start pulling that thread, we stop it. What do you get then? You get San Bernardino, you get Orlando, you get Boston, you get Chattanooga, one or two people, usually not directed, sometimes inspired. Let me give you an additional word, maybe even just justified. And by this I simply mean, this is somebody who wants to go do something bad because they're an isolated, unhappy person. And I can give that isolated, unhappy act greater meaning by just hooking it to this broader global thing. Now, you began this line of questioning with asking people like me and two of us, well, how do you stop it? Well, that one's really hard. I mean, I went through this, Joe, with Boston. After it was all done, the marathon bombers, the Tsarnaev kids, oh, for God's sake, they were going to these websites. And I said, let me get this right. You want me monitoring the web activity of an American citizen and a permanent legal resident? And of course, the instinctive answer is, oh, no, no, no. And I said, well, that's what you just told me to do. And I don't think either of us want to recommend that as a legitimate security measure in our countries.
So when we talk about cybersecurity, what are we really talking about then?
I think it's protection against a couple of things. One is the old-fashioned theft of information. I mentioned at a seminar we were at earlier today, the UN estimates that about $1 trillion a year in intellectual property is being stolen. That's money out of the shareholders' pockets of a whole bunch of companies. It's also more broadly, R&D information. There are a couple of countries that steal a lot of money from our scientific and technological sectors. And then there's the risk, I think, of these various actors actually taking control of some aspects of our economy or of our infrastructure. Mike was mentioning this morning what the Russians have done in Crimea, Moldova, and Estonia, and a couple of other places. It is not only those two big countries that can do this. There are a couple of others who have this capacity as well. So I think on balance, it's those two things that we need to worry about, but also criminality, which we don't talk about a lot. Identity theft, the use of the internet for child pornography and harassment purposes, old-fashioned theft, just taking money out of people's pocketbooks. Those of us who work in national security don't talk as much about criminality as I think we should. It is a massive problem in North America. A lot of people who used to rob banks now sit at home and
do it on their computer.
Do it on their computer.
Yeah.
There's an element in the cyber domain with regard to threats. It's called convergence. So normally you have certain categories of threat actors. You have nation states, criminal gangs, and the anarchists, the LawSec and Anonymous and so on. And I used to conceptualize them as fairly distinct groups. They're not anymore. They're beginning to get a real blend so that, for example, an awful lot of Russian cyber activity is actually done on behalf of the Russian state by Russian criminal gangs. And then you get Iranian cyber activity or Syrian Free Electronic Army cyber activity that actually is being done by that third group, that disaffected, kind of guns for hire, that then join this broader cause and go out and strike against, well, in this case, against North America for their larger Islamic cause. But they're neither criminals nor states. they belong to this third group of anarchists, hacktivists,
Right.
and so on. So you're getting this blending of attackers, which for us makes the job even harder because our authorities differ based upon whom we think the attack is being mounted by.
Right. If it's a nation state, there's a different set of rules
Right.
than if it's a criminal or a
Right.
activist of some nature. Thank you both very much for your expertise. I appreciate your time.
Our pleasure. Thank you.